Hello and welcome back to another IELTS lesson. So in this lesson this is a new lesson in fact that I've been wanting to do for some time for writing, and I know that a lot of students kind of focus on the IELTS writing and find particular difficulties with IELTS writing. So I'm going to do another lesson today that I think is going to be really useful to you. And that is, we're going to be looking at a question, and then we're going to look at a previous IELTS 7 Plus student response. I'm going to keep them anonymous, difficult to say. I'm going to keep their identity secret, and I'm going to go through, I'm going to read their report without making changes. I'm going to sort of maybe give a little bit of feedback as I do an initial read through, and then I'm going to give it a Bandscore. Then what I'm going to do is go through the report and make changes and edits to any errors. And I think that this is something that you're going to find really useful in terms of seeing and spotting mistakes, identifying mistakes, and in terms of sort of also having an idea of the examiner's marking process for your writing. So hopefully it will be a really useful lesson. Of course, as always, do leave feedback on the course, leave me a note. It's always great to hear from you, and please drop me a message with any questions, of course. Okay, so here is our question that we'll be working on today, and it of course is a task 1 report. We have a line graph. So as always, first thing I'll do is read the title. Pollution levels in London, micrograms per cubic metre. So we're looking at the amount of pollution in London. Okay, interesting. Let's take a look. So along the actual key, we'll take a look at these lines. First, we've got sulfur dioxide and we've got smoke, 2 pollutants. Now, you don't have to know what these things are, sulfur dioxide. You don't need, as I always say, any scientific knowledge. We just simply need to report the trends, making comparisons where possible. Okay, so sulfur dioxide is definitely higher across all years. That's something that you could include in your overview. Overall, sulfur dioxide was far greater in terms of pollutants in the air than smoke, something like that. That was just off the top of my head. Smoke, yeah, they seem to follow similar trends as well, really. They're kind of both going up. There's a slight peak here. There's a steeper rise for both here. Another peak here, and then they fall. So we could say that the relationship over time seems to follow one another. So something that we could possibly write about in our overview as well. Okay, so along our x-axis, we have time, or the years, starting way back in 1550, going up in increments of 50 years, all the way up to more recent times, 2000, where we can see happily there's, according to this data anyway, less pollutants, far less pollutants. Okay, so the y-axis is micrograms per cubic metre, and we're going up at 250 at a time. Okay, so I've got a pretty good idea of the visual information for this. What I'm going to do now is just take a look at the student report. So I've taken out, this is exactly as the student wrote, and Google Docs did some checks and made some sort of highlighted errors. I've taken all that out so that you can't see what Google Docs spots. So as I read through, if you think as well about possible errors, possible things you might change, I'm probably not going to make too much feedback for the initial read through. So when I mark your writing, when I give you feedback, the quick feedback I try to do sometimes, I just read everything through first, and then I've got an idea of the Bandscore in my head. Then I can start making edits. Okay, so let's take a look at the report. And let's have a read through. The given line graph represents the sulfur dioxide and smoke levels by micrograms per cubic metre in London over a 400 period. from 1600 to 2000. Overall, sulfur dioxide and smoke continue increasing, with some little downwards in the first 250 years. Meanwhile, the next 200 years both saw bit by bit a rapidly decrease, with some fluctuations around 1910 to 1960. From 1600 to over 1870, sulfur dioxide rapidly increased the pollution levels around 685. Then stabilised approximately over 30 years, saw a pike around 1725 and have plateaued from 1750 to over 1790, around 685 micrograms per cubic metre. So I'm looking at the data here. I think we're describing around this area, would that be right? 1790 we're at, so around here, sorry. Following this, gradually increased for the next 60 years. So we're here and then off we go. For the next 60 years, over the 875. Next saw a downward and an upward for the other 20 years remaining, around the 875. On the other hand, smoke presented and steadily increased in this time window and sat over 380. The next 130 years from 1870 to 2000, both sulfur dioxide and smoke, experiment rapidly decreased to zero, the highest in sulfur dioxide. Nonetheless, the two of them experimented fluctuations between 1920 and 1970, though smoke variations were more remarkable. Okay, so there's quite a lot that we need to consider in this report, and I'm going to say, really, we're probably looking at a band score of around, after sort of some careful reading, 5.5 to 6, and possibly 6. And that's mainly because of grammatical errors throughout the writing. And really, grammar is one of those things that is the most common trip up for us. There's also some errors with vocabulary and tense. Spelling is also quite a big problem within the report. But there is a well-structured report here, so it's nice to see we've got some grouping. So we're doing, I think we're going from 1600 to 1870. So we're going from here all the way to here, and then from 1870 to 2000. I like that grouping. I can understand, even if I have to think about the grammar whilst I'm reading, I can understand how the student has structured the report. And it just makes it more logical for me whilst reading to know where I am, even if I was sort of here and thinking there. But I felt like well structured, well paragraphed. Introduction and overview were included, which was nice. So yeah, there are some good points to it, but the student really needs to be working on the grammar. So around 5.5 to 6. Again, depending on the IELTS examiner, you may move up to sort of 0.5 generally for a band score. It's not so common that it's going to be that different because, of course, through the examiner's training and experience, overall the quality should be about 0.5 or exactly the same. Okay, so it's a pretty straightforward question, I would say. Just we have two different attributes to the line graph, so we can just definitely report as it is. I think I would probably do something similar in terms of just really simply for grouping, just split it in half, just as this student did. Okay, so I'm going to go through and start making edits to this report. And this isn't going to be perfect. You know, I'm not going to change absolutely everything. There might be a couple of things that I miss, but it will give you a good overall idea of where some mistakes have been made. Okay, so the given line graph represents the sulfur dioxide. So straight away, this is a common error that many students make. And I'm going to leave it in bold where I make changes. Capitalizing when not required. And that's an error that I see a lot of. So unless there's a need for a capital letter, for example, with proper nouns, we don't need to capitalize these things. So the given line graph represents the sulfur dioxide and smoke levels by micrograms per cubic metre in London over a 400-year period. 400 years, so I even added the word in there that was missing. So, and again, there are a couple of examples here for vocabulary, our lexical resource of missing words possibly. So let's just read back. And smoke levels by micrograms per cubic metre in London over a 400-year period from 1600 to 2000. So I think really that was probably the only two changes I'd make. Something else that I might consider is to use brackets. So the given line graph represents the sulfur dioxide and smoke levels. And then just as a side note, and it's kind of showing off to the examiner, I could possibly use brackets here. And I think, you know what, I'm going to leave them in. I don't want to use loads of advanced punctuation. It just becomes a little bit too difficult to read. I think simple is often best. Try and make things as easy to read as possible. But for this example, I just think if we can add these brackets in, it just makes the sentence read a little easier. The given line graph represents the sulfur dioxide and smoke levels by micrograms per cubic metre in London over a 400-year period from 1600 to 2000. That really is top now, just with these 1, 2, 3 changes, and then it's a real sort of great sentence. And you can see that by adding the brackets, it just gives less importance to this extra detail. So before brackets, it was kind of too much of a long sentence, really. But by adding brackets, it just sort of gives a little bit of rest and keeps the important information emphasized. Okay, let's move on. Overall, sulfur dioxide. So we don't need the capital letter here. Overall, sulfur dioxide and smoke continue increasing with some little downward trends in the first 250 years. I'm actually going to make some edits here. Let's have a look. Overall, sulfur dioxide and smoke continue increasing. Continued. I think we want to stay in past tense, really. Sulfur dioxide, there's a spelling mistake there. Thank you. Thank you, Google Docs. I think that this continues throughout. So I've noticed this earlier when I was looking at this piece of writing. I'll try and remember to check that throughout. Overall, sulfur dioxide and smoke continued increasing. Continued to increasing. I'm okay with that. Continued increasing with some little. I don't really like the vocabulary choice there. With some small, we could say. With some small or slight sounds even better. With increasing with slight downwards in the first 250 years. Slight downwards something. I need a noun here. Downward is our adjective. Downward trends, we could say. Downward trends in the first 250 years. Now, let's take a look at that. So we've got 50, so we've got 50, 100, 150, 200, 250. Now, I actually kind of disagree with this part of the overview because I can't really see much of a downward trend. The only time I can really see is here. And it's such a slight downward trend or a drop that I'd actually call it a plateau. I don't think there's really any drops. We can see there's this here, there's this here. But I wouldn't say there are any downward trends. So in a way, I would almost be thinking, I'm not sure that that answers the question properly. Maybe we could rewrite this. Let me take a look and we can think about rewriting it, or I may just leave it in. Overall, sulfur dioxide and smoke continued increasing with slight downward trends in the first 250 years. Okay, I'm going to leave that in, but I would like you to remember that possibly that's not really answering the question because it's reporting something that might not be true. 50, 100, 150, 200, 250. We could maybe see here. I think I'll leave this in just because there's a possibility of slight downward trends. I mean, there is this here, so I will leave that in. It's probably not something that I would have reported in the overview, but Okay, so you can just see I've added a full stop here. So again, a common mistake that students often make is to not begin a new sentence when it's appropriate and to use commas too often. Okay, so that's kind of a grammar error, really, a punctuation and sentence structure error. So let's go on. So we've got the full stop. Meanwhile, the next two, during the next, as Google Docs just suggested, I think that makes more sense. During the next 200 years, both pollutants saw bit by bit a rapid decrease. 50, 100, 150, 200, 250. So I think he's reporting, this student is reporting from 1800. Both pollutants saw bit by bit a rapid decrease with some fluctuations around 1910 to 1960. There are fluctuations here. That's more around the 1920 to sort of 70 mark, 75 mark. That's okay. I'm going to say during the next 200 years, both pollutants saw a rapid decrease. I think he's probably reporting from around here. So what I would say is possibly to rewrite this and say from 1900 onwards, or we could even say from let's call that 1880. From 1880, let's say that, from 1880 onwards, comma, both pollutants saw a rapid decrease. So we need to make a change here. So this is a larger change, and you can see that's kind of why it's probably around that 5.5 band score, because in terms of improving and getting the report to be accurate, I need to make these bigger sweeping changes. The bigger the changes you need to make, the lower really the band score is going to be. For those higher band scores, 7.5s, 8s, there is only these smaller changes that you need to make. So yeah, that's why really we're looking at a 5.5 most probably. From 1880 onwards, both pollutants saw a rapid decrease with some fluctuations from, let's say, this point here. So we're going to say from, let's say 1920. Just as a side note, you know, if you don't think you're quite right, or that's maybe 1915 or 1925, don't worry. The examiner's not going to be thinking, actually, you're 5-10 years out. As long as you're roughly close, that's fine. With some fluctuations from 1920, with some downward fluctuations, I would say. I'm going to leave that in because there's sort of all these fluctuations here. Okay, so let's read back the overview. Overall, sulfur dioxide and smoke continued increasing with slight downward trends in the first 250 years. Okay, so this sentence is splitting the graph in two. So let's move on. From 1880 onwards, both pollutants saw a rapid decrease with some fluctuations from 1920. Okay, that's good. I think that's a pretty solid overview. It's probably not what I would go for. I would have probably said that sulfur dioxide and smoke follow each other in terms of downwards and upward trends throughout the line graph. I probably would have also said that sulfur dioxide is by far the highest pollutant in the air throughout the time span of the line graph. So they're more overview ideas that I would go for. However, this kind of works for me as well. I think that's pretty good. Okay, let's move on. From 1600 to 1870, so a slight change there. Simple is good. Often students will add in vocabulary where it's not really needed. It's not a huge grammatical error, but simple is best. From 1600 to 1870, so we're going from here, missing a little bit of the data, but I'm not going to worry too much. From 1600 to 1870, so we're actually going to this part here. It looks like he's split the graph this part. And that's fine. It's not even. It's not straight down the middle. However, you know, as long as there's enough reporting of both sets of data, group 1, group 2, that's fine. From 1600 to 1870, sulfur dioxide. So we've got this. Oh, sorry, I'm spelling it wrong now. Sulfur dioxide rapidly increased. So So we can see that Google's even pointing these things out again. Sulfur dioxide rapidly increased the pollution levels to let's say to around 685 micrograms. I'm just going to add this in. It's important to give the measurement, the measuring language that we're using. Increase the pollution, rapidly increased in pollution levels, in pollution levels to around 685 micrograms. This figure, so there the sentence really is not started correctly. This figure then stabilized, so we've got a spelling mistake here, stabilized. Now I'm British, stabilized, 1 minute, stabilized, here we go, stabilized. So this is the British spelling of the word, and yeah, I'm British, so that's how I like to spell things. But remember that if you spell the American or the British format, it doesn't make a difference for your band score. This figure then stabilized approximately over 30 years. So we're at 1870, and it's saying that the figure sort of stabilized, and it does. I would say for sulfur dioxide, there's actually a drop from there. So again, probably not really doing. But let's see, where exactly are we? This figure then stabilized approximately over 30 years. So we're going from 16. I'm not sure what year we're talking about here. Saw a peak around 1725. So it looks like we may be saying from this part here, from 1670 to 1780. I think that's probably where we're going from. Let's say, I think there needs to be a larger change to this sentence. This figure, pollute to around 685. So we're 685 micrograms. Let's take a look. I'm trying to work out where the student is, which kind of shows that the organisation's not quite right. From 1600 to 1870, sulfur dioxide rapidly increased to 685 to 1870. So I think he's talking around here, that part there. And then he sort of seems to flick back to this stabilise over 30 years. I think we're at this point here. Seems to be maybe from 1750. I think there's it's difficult to edit this, but just so you know, I'm going to actually put this in italics. I think that really the student needs to think more carefully about how and where we're reporting. So signalling to the examiner what years we're talking about. For example, you could say during the first, let's say, 100 to 150 years. Let's say during the first 125 years, both pollutants saw significant increases. Let's say, and then I could, go in and sort of explain how much smoke kind of goes up a lot as well. I could maybe say although sulfur dioxide saw far greater rises, so far greater increases. Let's say that. However, there's a repetition here, saw significant gains, I'll say, so that we're not repeating ourselves. So this is probably something that I would start off with for this graph. So although it's paragraphed and structured well, it's actually, there's some errors really in terms of how the student is step by step explaining. Let's continue. Following this gradual increase for the next 60 years over the 865, saw a downward trend. So again, there's some big grammar mistakes in here. So I'm not going to go through again and edit this, but I wonder if I can make some quick edits. Following this gradual increase for the next 60 years. So we could probably just get rid of this. There was a gradual increase over the next there was, so we're already in the past tense, over the next 60 years. And here really the student needs to be saying where, from da-da-da to da-da-da-da, from wherever, sorry, we're in dates, right? There you go, from blah, 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 blah to blah, 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 over the 865 microgram mark, we could say. So that's been added in. So you can really see now that this is definitely more, as I go deeper into the report, it's definitely more of a 5.5. There are some real changes that we need to make, and I think really that this is not going to be that 6. So yeah, and we can just go through and continue to make edits. So next saw a downward and upward trend for the next for 20 years. So keep that out for 20 years. Upward trend. Google is already suggesting trend. How very clever. Next, comma. Not the best in terms of opening phrases. Next, we can see. Generally, we don't use too many pronouns, but I'm going to use that here just to structure the sentence in a slightly better way. Next, we can see a downward and upward trend for 20 years that remains, that stabilizes at around, I think that's what the student is wanting to say here, around 875. Take this out, 875 micrograms. So it's difficult for me also to use synonyms for micrograms, but I'm not going to worry too much about that, as that is the given measurement. On the other hand, smoke presented a steady increase. I'm going to keep presented in there, that works for me. We don't need a steady increase over this time. Time window over this time, and sat at over 380 within the year 1, 2, 3, 4. So again, just signalling really clearly to the examiner what year, what date, when in the data you are reporting. So again, I just want to know a little bit clearer where this student is. We know that we're looking between 1600 to 1870, but then specifically within the sentences, state where we are. Over the next, so straight away, over the next 130 years. Over the next, you don't need the comma there, from 1870 to 2000, both sulfur, no need for the brackets, both sulfur dioxide, spelling mistake there. Both sulfur dioxide and smoke experience. I'm going to try and get rid of that. Experienced. And I do believe the student made this mistake twice. Experienced a rapid decrease to 0, the highest in sulfur dioxide. To 0, let's get rid of this extra detail here. To 0 micrograms. Nonetheless, the two of them experienced fluctuations between 1920. Okay, yes. Nonetheless, okay, I'll leave that in. That's more of a task 2 style opening phrase, but I think it does quite work to say, because we're saying here, eventually went to 0 micrograms, pretty much. Nonetheless, kind of works because we're contrasting the two. Nonetheless, the two of them. Let's say the two of them, I don't quite like that. The two pollutants, I'll use again. The two pollutants experienced fluctuations between 1920, to 1970. Okay, that's about right. Though smoke variations were more remarkable. And that's definitely right. And I think that this is just a really good example of where the student has actually stated what years we're talking about. And it just makes it so much easier for the examiner to understand. Okay, so let's get rid of this. So there's more here. Yeah, I'm definitely going to say initially it was a 5.5. And possibly that might even be slightly generous, but I think there is some good reporting in there, but the student really needs to say exactly where in the data we're talking about, but also be careful with grammar. There was quite a lot of grammar and vocabulary issues throughout the report. It was a great attempt, and a lot of us are starting off at this, or sort of maybe even slightly lower. Don't let that make you afraid of the IELTS test. It takes time and practice, but also consistent study to really get to the point where you can be writing those 7.5 reports and essays. And just remember that to score a band score of 7 or 7.5, you need a great deal of fluency. That is not an easy task. So it does take time, it takes effort, but you can see here that this is probably now, going to be, I don't think it's perfect, but it's up towards the 8.5, I would have thought, especially in terms of language and grammar. But it's definitely not perfect. I would rewrite this very differently. However, trying to keep things close to the student's report and making some adjustments, this is what we get to, and it's a huge improvement on what we had before. Okay, so I think really it would be good for you to pause the video and you can have another read through this. As I say, it's not perfect, but it's definitely a big improvement on what we first saw. And yeah, let me know if you found this video useful, and I'll try and add some more live feedback videos. And I hope everyone is well, and I hope to hear from you soon.